The two Blackhawks came out of the storm like something that didn't ask permission. No radio warning, no flight plan filed with Harbor Reach Medical Center's rooftop dispatch. Just the concussive thud of rotors punching through a wall of rain at 11:17 on a Tuesday night, and then the helicopters were down on the emergency pad, and men in wet tactical gear were already moving before the skids fully touched concrete. The charge nurse on duty, a veteran named Dolores, stepped outside with a flashlight and immediately stepped back in. "Call Dr. Harmon," she said. "Call everybody." Nobody on the hospital staff had seen anything like it. The soldiers carried their wounded the way people carry something they are not willing to put down. One of the operators, a large man with a compress pressed hard against his side, was still talking into a headset. Another walked with a limp so severe his boot was dragging, but he refused a wheelchair and kept moving forward under his own power. The one on the stretcher, the one they would later learn was the reason all of this had happened, was not moving at all. The team leader, a man with a jaw like a concrete block and eyes that had stopped registering anything that wasn't a threat, pushed past Dolores and grabbed the nearest person in scrubs. "Where is Echo?" Dolores blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Echo," he repeated, and his voice didn't rise, which somehow made it worse. "We were told Echo was here. That's the only reason we came to this facility. Where is she?" Nobody had an answer. Nobody knew what he was talking about. And the man on the stretcher had maybe 4 minutes before the question would stop mattering entirely. If you've been following stories like this one, you already know the kind of woman everyone ignores until they can't anymore. Before we go any further, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Like this video, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Harbor Reach, and to the woman nobody saw coming. Nora Voss had been a nurse at Harbor Reach Medical Center for 3 years, and in that time she had learned how to become invisible. It was not a skill she'd been born with. Invisibility, the useful kind, the kind that lets you move through rooms without drawing fire, is something you practice. You keep your voice flat, you don't push back in the moment, you write it down, you note it, you wait. You wear your hair back in a clip that costs $2 because anything that looks considered gets noticed, and getting noticed at Harbor Reach meant getting targeted. The hospital sat on the edge of Caldwell Point, a mid-sized coastal city in South Carolina that liked to call itself a medical hub without having the staffing ratios to back it up. Harbor Reach was the largest trauma center in a 40-mile radius, which meant it handled things it wasn't always equipped to handle, which meant the pressure inside it ran at a constant low boil, which meant the people at the top were always looking for someone to blame when things went wrong. Dr. Marcus Holt had been the trauma director for 11 years. He was not a stupid man. Stupid men are easier to navigate because their cruelty is blunt. Holt was intelligent, which made his cruelty architectural. He built structures around it, gave it institutional vocabulary, made it look like quality control. When he humiliated someone, he did it in the language of performance reviews and patient outcomes, and the very real burden of maintaining standards in a high-acuity environment. You couldn't argue with any of it directly without sounding like you were arguing against patient safety. Nora had watched him do it to 3 nurses before her. She'd told herself she would be different, that she'd find a way to work around him. 3 years in, she was still working around him. That Tuesday had started the way bad days often start at Harbor Reach, with paperwork that wasn't hers. Someone in the overnight shift had misfiled a medication reconciliation for a post-surgical patient in Bay 6, and because Nora had been the last nurse to touch that chart before the error propagated through the system, the error now had her name on it. It didn't matter that the timestamps didn't line up. It didn't matter that the handwriting on the paper form, the hospital still used paper backups during system audits, wasn't hers. What mattered was that Dr. Holt had the paperwork in his hand at 7:15 in the morning during rounds, and he had an audience. "Voss," he said, without looking up from the chart. "Walk me through your thinking on this." The other residents looked at their shoes. 2 of the senior nurses suddenly became very interested in a supply cart across the hall. Nora stood her ground and said calmly, "That entry wasn't made by me. The timestamp shows 1900 hours. I wasn't on the floor at 1900. The chart has your co-signature. I co-signed the original entry at 1430. What's below it was added later. You can check the audit log." He finally looked up. His expression was the kind that had been refined over decades. Not anger, which would be too obvious, but a specific variety of patience that implied the person he was being patient with was the problem. The audit log, he said, shows a modification at 1900 under your credentials. Nora felt the cold drop in her chest that she'd felt before, in other contexts, when she understood that the fight she was in was not the one she'd prepared for. Then someone used my login, she said, which is a security issue, not a charting issue. That's a serious accusation. I'm making a serious observation. The pause that followed was almost theatrical. Holt closed the chart and tucked it under his arm. I'd encourage you to think carefully about how you document your observations going forward, he said. For everyone's protection. He walked away. The residents followed. The supply cart became less interesting to the senior nurses, and they drifted back to their stations, and Nora stood alone in the hallway and breathed through her nose until her hands unclenched. She'd learned to do that too, unclenching her hands without visibly unclenching them. By the time she got to the break room, the paperwork had already been routed to Sheila Okafor, the hospital's patient services director, with a note from Holt's administrative assistant recommending a formal review. Sheila was not an unreasonable woman, but she was a practical one, and the practical thing at Harbor Reach was to stay on Holt's good side. The formal review would be scheduled, it would be thorough, and at the end of it, regardless of what the audit log said, Nora's record would carry a flag. She ate her lunch standing up, next to the window that looked out over the ambulance bay. The storm that had been threatening since Sunday had started making good on its promises. The sky over the coast was the color of old pewter, and the palms outside the ER entrance were already swinging. The Weather Service had upgraded Tropical Storm Delia to a Category 1 overnight, and then revised that assessment before noon. By 6 p.m., the revised estimate had it making landfall somewhere between Caldwell Point and the Georgia state line by midnight. They were going to be slammed. They always were when a storm hit the coast. She was pulling the last 15 minutes of her lunch break when Kira Watts, one of the newer ER nurses, slid into the seat across from her. Kira was 26 and hadn't yet learned to be strategic about her expressions, which meant Nora could read her clearly. Sheila asked me if I'd seen you falsify anything, Kira said. Nora looked at her. What did you say? I said I'd never seen you falsify anything. I said you were one of the most careful nurses on this floor. Kira pulled at a thread on her scrub sleeve. She wrote it down. She wrote down what I said, and then she asked me if I was aware that loyalty to a colleague could be misread as complicity. Sheila said that. Verbatim. Nora looked back out the window. The palms were really going now. Thank you for telling me. Nora, Kira's voice dropped. I think they're actually going to let you go. I think Holt has decided you're the problem he wants to solve this quarter, and Sheila is going to give him whatever he needs to do it. I think you should, I don't know, document everything. Get union rep involved. The union rep is friendly with Holt's department head. Then get a lawyer. On what grounds? So far, all I have is a charting discrepancy and a director who made a pointed comment during rounds. Kira stared at her. How are you this calm? It was a reasonable question. Nora thought about answering it honestly, which would have taken longer than her remaining break time allowed. So she said, I've had practice, and went back to work. The afternoon was the controlled chaos that pre-storm hours always brought to a coastal trauma center. People who'd waited too long to fill prescriptions, a construction worker who'd been trying to finish a job before the weather hit and had introduced a circular saw to his forearm in the process, 2 separate elderly patients who'd fallen while boarding up windows, and a steady procession of minor lacerations and anxiety presentations. Nora moved through all of it in the way she'd been moving through her work for 3 years, quietly competent, invisible where it helped, visible where it was necessary. At 4:40, a patient in Bay 3 coded. He was 61, post-op from a bypass 2 days ago, and the code was not unexpected. His cardiac function had been borderline since surgery, and the stress of the incoming storm had not helped. What was less expected was that the attending on duty, a second-year resident named Finch, who was technically under Holt's supervision, completely locked up. Nora had seen it happen before. It was not a character flaw. The training didn't always stick until it had to, and sometimes the first real code was the one where the hands forgot what they'd practiced. Finch stood at the foot of the bed with the crash cart beside him, and simply stopped moving, and there were 4 seconds, she counted them, where nobody did anything. 4 seconds is not a long time. 4 seconds is also the difference between a brain that recovers and one that doesn't. Nora moved to the head of the bed, positioned herself, and started compressions. "Get the epinephrine ready," she said to the tech beside her. "Finch, I need you on the airway." Finch snapped back. He moved. The team locked in around the patient and ran the code for 18 minutes before they got return of spontaneous circulation, and by the time the attending cardiologist arrived from the third floor to take over, the patient was stable and being prepped for transfer. Holt appeared at the bay entrance while the transfer was still being organized. He looked at the documentation Finch was completing, and then he looked at Nora, and the expression on his face was specific. Not anger, not gratitude, but the particular displeasure of a man who had been denied the outcome he was expecting. "Voss," he said, "a word." She followed him into the corridor. "You initiated compressions," he said, before the attending called the code. The attending was delayed responding. The patient was in arrest. "You should have waited for Dr. Finch." Dr. Finch was experiencing response delay. Waiting wasn't compatible with the patient's survival. Holt looked at her for a long moment. Outside, through the window at the end of the hallway, the first real bands of rain were starting to hit. Not drops, but curtains, the way coastal storms come when they're serious. The lights flickered once. The backup generators kicked in with a low hum that ran through the floor. "Your formal review," Holt said, "has been moved to Thursday morning. I'd suggest you use tonight to get your documentation in order." He paused. "All of it." He walked away again. This time, Nora noticed, he didn't turn back. She stood there for 3 breaths, listening to the generator's hum and the rain assault the window glass, and then she went back to work. By 9 o'clock, the storm had swallowed the coast. The power cycled twice in 40 minutes before the generators held for good, and the ER filled up fast. Cars that had gotten into trouble on flooded roads, storm debris impacts, a family of 4 who'd evacuated too late and tried to shelter in a car that subsequently flooded. The night staff was overwhelmed almost immediately, and Nora's shift had technically ended at 7, but she hadn't gone home because you don't go home when the water is rising and you're a trauma nurse, and there are 4 beds short and a waiting room that keeps adding chairs. She was in the middle of suturing a laceration on a 13-year-old boy who'd caught flying glass when the lights in Bay 2 went out entirely and came back amber. Not the white of the backup systems, but the deep amber of the emergency-only circuit, which meant something had tripped a breaker somewhere significant. Dolores appeared in the doorway. Her face had a specific quality that Nora recognized. Not panic, but the containment of panic. "There are helicopters on the roof," Dolores said. Nora finished the stitch she was on and tied it off. "Military?" "I don't know. Nobody called them in. They just landed." Nora handed off to the tech, snapped off her gloves, and followed Dolores toward the rooftop access corridor. She was halfway there when the doors to the emergency stairwell opened and the men came in. There were 8 of them mobile, 2 on stretchers, and 1 being carried, chest to chest, by the largest of the operators, who showed no sign of slowing down regardless of what carrying a full-grown man through a stairwell in wet gear actually cost him. The team leader was ahead of them all. He had a controlled walk that ate distance without appearing to hurry, and his eyes moved through the space with the specific pattern of a person assessing threats before they assessed anything else. He grabbed Dolores. "Where is Echo?" Dolores said what Dolores said. "I'm sorry?" "Echo. We have intelligence this facility has an operator registered as Echo on their personnel roster. We need Echo. Now." "Sir, I don't know who—" "We have a critical exsanguination. He has minutes." The team leader's voice was so flat it was almost medical. "I need Echo, or I need the best trauma surgeon you have on this floor, and I need them right now." Holt appeared from around the corner. He'd been in radiology reviewing films, and someone had called him. He was already in his director posture, the one that expanded his actual height by approximately 2 social inches. "I'm Dr. Marcus Holt," he said, "trauma director. These men need to be triaged." "Are you Echo?" the team leader asked. Holt blinked. "I'm the trauma director." "I didn't ask you that." "No one here goes by that designation." Holt straightened. "If your men need treatment, we will need their identification, and we will need to follow proper protocol for receiving military personnel." "Set up Bay 1, Holt's resident Finch said quietly from behind him. He'd appeared without anyone noticing. "The bleeder goes straight to Bay 1. Holt turned. Finch met his eyes and didn't look away. The team leader was already moving. The man with the chest-to-chest carry went first, and the rest of the team flowed around Holt like water around a stone, and within 90 seconds, Bay 1 was the loudest room in the building. Nora was in the doorway. She'd come down from the rooftop corridor when she heard the voices and had positioned herself at the edge of the bay because that was her job. Position yourself where you're useful, stay out of the way until you're needed. From where she stood, she could see the patient clearly. His name, she would learn later, was not something she'd be allowed to write in any chart that left this building. He was male, mid-30s, with the build of someone who had been extremely physical for a very long time and was currently experiencing the consequences of a penetrating wound to the left thorax that had been partially controlled in the field with a hemostatic dressing and a lot of manual pressure and not much else. The dressing was soaked through. The pressure wasn't holding. Holt moved to the head of the table with the authority of a man in his own hospital. "Get me a chest tray," he said, "and call Nguyen in thoracic. We're going to need—" The patient's oxygen saturation dropped 11 points in 4 seconds. Nora saw it on the monitor before anyone else because she was already looking at the monitor. "He's in tension," she said. "We don't have confirmation of tracheal deviation. Diminished breath sounds on the left. SAT is 82 and dropping." She was already moving. "He's in tension pneumothorax. He needs decompression right now." "Voss, stand down." "Needle decompression, second intercostal." "I said stand down." Holt's voice cracked across the room. "You are not the physician in this bay. You will not touch this patient until I authorize." The patient's SAT hit 78. The monitor alarmed. The team leader, who had been watching from 3 feet away with his arms crossed and his jaw set, took one step forward. "Whoever can fix this," he said, very quietly, "fix this." And Nora Voss pushed up her sleeve. It was not a theatrical gesture. She did it the way you do it when you're about to work. Practical, reflexive, reaching for the tray. The sleeve came up past her elbow, and the fluorescent light in Bay 1 caught the inside of her right forearm and the tattoo that lived there. A small, precise design, not decorative, not ornamental, the kind that means something specific to a specific community, was suddenly visible to every person in that room. She heard the sound from behind her before she processed what it meant. It was the team leader. He made a sound that was not quite a word. It was the compressed noise of a man who has spent years prepared for almost everything and has just encountered the exception. "Echo," he said. Not a question, not a demand, just her name, her real name. Nora's hands were already on the page. She didn't turn around. 14-gauge needle, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, she said, and her voice had changed. Not louder, not harder, just different, the way a different gear is different, and everyone in that room could hear it. "I need someone on that chest tray. I need another set of hands on his pressure, not because it's working, but because I need to know when it stops." She paused half a second. "And I need this bay clear of everyone who isn't actively treating him." The team leader said, "You heard her." His operators moved without hesitation. Finch moved. The techs moved. Marcus Holt did not move. "Voss," he said, and his voice had a quality she had never heard from him before. Not authority, but something underneath authority, something that sounded almost like uncertainty. "Voss, I am your direct supervisor, and I am ordering you to—" "Dr. Holt." The team leader turned to look at him, and the look was not hostile. It was simply complete, the way a closed door is complete. "You have 2 options. You can assist, or you can clear the bay. Those are the options available to you right now. This is my hospital, and this is my operator, and the woman currently saving his life has a record that—" He stopped himself, looked at Nora's back, then quieter. "She has a record that would make your surgical department look like a first aid course. So I'm going to ask you one more time, and then I'm going to stop asking." Nora had the needle placed. She heard the rush of air that meant she was right, that the tension was releasing, that the lung had a chance to re-expand, that the man on the table had just been given back the minutes that were slipping away from him 30 seconds ago. She felt the shift in the room, the change in breathing, the way a team sounds when the immediate terror steps back one notch. "Chest tube," she said. "We're not done." Finch handed her what she needed without being asked. She worked, and the bay was quiet the way bays are quiet, when something real is happening, and Dr. Marcus Holt stood at the edge of the room with his arms at his sides and watched a nurse he had spent 3 years trying to diminish, do something he was no longer certain he could have done himself. Outside, Tropical Storm Delia was tearing the coast apart at the seams. The power flickered once more and held. Rain moved against the windows in waves. Nobody left Bay 1. Nobody spoke unless it was necessary. And Nora Voss, Echo, kept working. The chest tube went in clean on the first pass, which was not something Nora took credit for. It was muscle memory from a time and a place she had spent 3 years trying to put distance between herself and muscle memory does not care how much distance you've tried to put. Blood and air moved through the tube. The monitor climbed. 78 became 84, became 91, and by the time it crossed 93, the patient's color had begun its slow return from the gray-blue of oxygen debt toward something closer to viable. Finch had the IV access. One of the operators, a compact, precise woman with a medical patch on her sleeve who had positioned herself at the supply tray without being asked, was drawing up the medications Nora called for in sequence, passing them in the right order without fumbling, and Nora noted this without commenting on it because there wasn't time to comment, and because it told her something important about how this team operated. "He's still losing pressure somewhere," the operator medic said quietly. "I know." Nora had her hand on the patient's abdomen. The rigidity she felt there was not from the chest wound. "He's got secondary abdominal involvement, blunt trauma or secondary fragmentation. I can't tell without imaging, but something in there is bleeding." "We took fire after the primary exfil point," the team leader said from the doorway. He had not left. He had also not entered, which she understood was a specific kind of respect, staying close without crowding. Martinez took the direct hit. Rowe caught debris. "We didn't have time to fully assess before extraction." "Rowe is your abdominal patient?" "Yes." "Where is he?" "Bay 2. Your staff has him." Nora looked at Finch. Finch nodded once, meaning he understood, meaning he could handle Martinez for the next 4 minutes while she moved. She stripped her gloves, took new ones from the box on the wall, and walked out of Bay 1 and into Bay 2. Rowe was conscious, which was either good or irrelevant depending on what was happening inside him. He was a tall man, late 20s, with the kind of blonde hair that looked wrong in an emergency setting, too bright, too ordinary against the blood on his collar. I was gripping the side rail of the gurney with one hand and staring at the ceiling with the expression of a man who is doing long division in his head to stay present. The nurse attending him was a second-year named Patrick, who was good at his job but had never seen a combat casualty and was moving a half-beat slower than the situation required. Nora looked at the vitals, looked at the abdomen, looked at the rate at which the abdominal rigidity was progressing compared to what the team leader had described about the timeline of the injury. "Fast exam," she said. "Now. And get me a surgeon, not a resident, an actual surgeon. Paige Okafor if you have to. She's been moonlighting trauma since Hendricks is out." Patrick blinked. "Dr. Holt is in Bay 1. Paige Okafor." She had her hands on Rowe's abdomen when he spoke. "You Echo?" he asked. His voice had the flatness of someone who had taken something for the pain but not quite enough. "Don't talk," she said. Team leader said to find Echo if things went sideways, said Echo would fix it. He coughed, and the cough made his vitals blip in a way she didn't love. "Things went pretty sideways." "They did. I'm working on it. Stop talking." "Are you going to tell me you're not her?" She pressed 2 fingers below his left lower rib margin and watched his face. The wince was involuntary and immediate. "I'm going to tell you to breathe normally and stop using energy on conversation," she said. "That's what I'm going to tell you." He almost smiled. It didn't reach his eyes, but it was there. "That's a no," he said. The fast probe went on. The image that came back showed what she'd expected and didn't want to see. Free fluid in Morrison's pouch, hepatorenal space, a collection that was growing slowly but was definitely growing. Rowe had a liver laceration that hadn't fully declared itself in the field and was now making up for lost time. She straightened. "He needs the OR." Patrick had the phone in his hand. "Okafor's coming down. She was already in the building." "Good. Tell her hepatic laceration, grade 2 minimum, possible grade 3. He's compensating, but he won't be for long." She went back to Bay 1. The scene she returned to was different from the one she'd left. Martinez was stable, not fixed, not safe, but temporarily stable, which was what stable meant in trauma, and the team's medic had taken the secondary position that the operator medic had occupied, working the monitors with the kind of focused calm that came from having done exactly this in conditions far worse than a hospital bay. Finch was documenting with the speed of a man who understood that documentation was what allowed the next set of hands to do their job. And Marcus Holt was standing in the corner. He had his arms crossed. He was watching. His face was doing something complicated that Nora didn't have the bandwidth to read, and she filed it away for later because later was when she'd have the luxury of caring about his facial expressions. The team leader straightened when she came in. Martinez? Stable for now. He needs continuous monitoring. If his pressure drops, we're going to have decisions to make about OR access. She looked at him directly. Rowe is going to surgery within the hour. Okafor is good. He'll be okay. Something moved across the team leader's face. Not relief. It was more compressed than relief. More controlled. That's 4 of 7, he said. What? 4 of my people are currently in your hospital. I have 3 more in the building who walked in on their own. He paused. I need to know they're all being seen. Give me the triage list. He pulled a folded piece of paper from inside his jacket. Actual paper, handwritten, because that was what you used when systems went down, and handed it to her. She read it in 12 seconds. The shoulder dislocation in Bay 4 is straightforward. The laceration on the man in the waiting room needs imaging before closure because the mechanism is wrong for a clean cut. And whoever is managing the one with the head injury needs a neuroconsult, not just a GCS assessment. She handed the paper back. I'll make sure they're flagged. He looked at her for a moment, then, what do they call you here? She held his gaze. Voss? Nora Voss? But you're Echo. I've been Nora Voss for 3 years. The team leader looked at the floor for a brief second, then back up. He had a way of processing things that was entirely internal. No expression shift, no verbal acknowledgement, just a momentary pause, and then the continuation of whatever came next. My name is Garrett, he said. Sergeant Major Dale Garrett, JSOC. We weren't supposed to end up here. Where were you supposed to end up? Beaufort Naval. It went down in the storm. Communications failure, and then the rooftop wasn't accessible. Someone on the helicopter pulled your facility from a secondary contact list. He said this like it was relevant information she needed, and not like he was making conversation, because Dale Garrett didn't make conversation. The secondary contact list is classified, Voss. Your name on it is classified. It has your current name on it. Nora went very still. Someone kept you in the system, Garrett said. After everything, someone kept you flagged as an active resource. She looked at Martinez on the table, at the monitors, at Finch, who was doing his job with his head down and his ears presumably working fine. This isn't the conversation we're having right now, she said. Agreed. I just want you to know that I know someone kept you in, and I don't know who, and that matters. He stepped back. I'll be outside the bay. Call me if Martinez changes. He left. The room breathed differently with him gone. Not easier exactly, but less compressed. Holt hadn't moved from his corner. Nora checked Martinez's vitals, confirmed the tube placement, adjusted the flow rate on the secondary IV, and was about to step toward the supply tray when Holt said quietly, Who are you? She didn't stop moving. You've worked with me for 3 years. That's not what I asked. She picked up the chart. I'm your nurse, Dr. Holt. Tonight, apparently, I'm also the person who stabilized 2 of those operators. Tomorrow morning, I'm also apparently still the subject of a formal review. She made a notation on the chart. So you tell me which version of that question you actually want answered. He was quiet for a long time. Outside the bay, she could hear the storm. Not just rain now, but the deeper sound of wind doing structural work, pressing on the building with intent. Somewhere down the corridor, a door swung and latched and swung again. Your tattoo, he said. She didn't respond. I've seen that mark before, Holt said. Once, years ago during a conference in Bethesda. A woman had it. A surgeon. I thought she was a surgeon, but now I'm not. I don't know what she was. I just remember the mark. He uncrossed his arms. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. She walked into a room, and the military personnel in the room just deferred. All of them. Was there something you needed for Martinez? Nora asked. He didn't answer. She wasn't sure if it was because he had nothing to say, or because he was still working through something that didn't have language yet. Either way, she didn't push it. The next 40 minutes belonged to the work. The storm made demands on the building, and the building made demands on the staff, and the staff made demands on Nora, who moved through it all with the flat-footed efficiency of a person who has been the most exhausted person in the room and kept going anyway. 2 more storm casualties arrived. A teenager with a pneumothorax from a car compression injury that she was already prepared for because the storm had been building to exactly this kind of accident, and an elderly man with a neck laceration from shattering glass who looked frightening but was, underneath the blood, not critical. She triaged both. She flagged Kira to the teenager and took the elderly man herself, talking him through the assessment in a low voice that she'd been told years ago by someone whose name she didn't say out loud anymore was the most calming voice he'd ever heard in a combat environment. He hadn't meant it as a compliment about her bedside manner. At some point, Sheila Okafor materialized in the corridor. Not the patient services director Sheila, but the surgeon Sheila, Dr. Sheila Okafor, who had 2 names and 2 jobs, and used them both with the efficiency of a woman who had stopped apologizing for her own competence approximately 15 years ago. She was short, 52, and moved through a hospital the way ships move through water. Not fast, but with displacement. "Ro is in the OR," she said, finding Nora between bays. "Grade 2 lac, manageable. He's going to lose about 45 minutes and come out the other side." She looked at Nora with the direct gaze of someone who'd been in enough situations to recognize another professional clearly. "Garrett says you did the field triage on all of them." I assessed. The team's medic had already done primary treatment in the field. "He also says," Okafor paused, in the way people pause when they're deciding how to say the next thing. "He says you used to run trauma protocols for JSOC operations." The corridor was not empty. There were 2 techs at the end of it, a resident coming out of Bay 3, the muffled noise of the storm making the walls feel closer than they were. This was not where this conversation should happen. "Dr. Okafor," Nora said. "How is Martinez?" Okafor accepted the redirect without showing whether she wanted to. "Finch has him. He's holding. If he makes it through the next 2 hours without another drop, he'll probably avoid a second intervention." She fell into step beside Nora. "The formal review that Holt scheduled? Thursday morning." "I know. I'm on the review committee." Okafor's voice was steady, not sympathetic, which Nora found more useful than sympathy. "I want you to know that I have seen the audit log and the modification timestamp, and the fact that you were not credentialed to the system at 1900. I want you to know I noted that before tonight." Nora glanced at her. "I haven't said anything yet," Okafor continued, "because the politics in this building require a certain amount of patience. But Thursday is Thursday, and tonight is—" She gestured vaguely at the bay doors, the operators visible through the windows, the storm making the entire building vibrate at a frequency you felt in your back teeth. "Tonight is something else." They had reached Bay 1. Through the window, Martinez's numbers were stable. Finch had his head down, focused. One of Garrett's operators had pulled a chair to the corner of the room and was present without being in the way, which was something only people with training managed, being in a room without cluttering it. "Why are you telling me this tonight?" Nora asked. Okafor looked at her. "Because in 40 years of medicine, I have never watched a nurse run a trauma bay the way you ran that one. And I've been letting myself believe that what Holt does to good clinicians is above my pay grade to address." She paused. "Apparently tonight is when I'm done believing that." She walked away before Nora could respond, which was fine because Nora didn't have a response prepared for that particular sentence. The next escalation came from a direction nobody had anticipated. At midnight, a man in a suit arrived at the hospital's main entrance. He was not wet. This was notable because the storm outside was not the kind you navigated without getting wet, which meant he had come from somewhere inside the building, or he had come in a vehicle that delivered him to the door with precision. And either way, arriving in a suit without getting wet in this storm was the kind of thing you did if you wanted to make a specific point about who controlled the circumstances. His name, he told the security desk, was Arthur Pembroke. He had federal identification. He asked for the charge nurse, the trauma director, and the administrator on call, in that order, and he asked in the tone of a man who had made this kind of request before and had never once been told no. Dolores called Nora. Nora was in the medication room when her radio crackled. She stood for a moment with a bag of saline in her hand, listening to Dolores's description of the man at the desk, and felt something cold move through her that was not fear exactly, but was related to fear. The sensation of a door she had shut very firmly from the inside beginning to open from the outside. She knew what federal identification at a hospital during a classified military casualty event meant. She also knew what it meant that the contact list had her name on it. She set the saline down and walked toward the main entrance. Garrett was already there. He'd positioned himself between Pembroke and the security desk with the geometric precision of a man who understood spatial control, and Pembroke, who was tall, gray, with the ageless look of a bureaucrat who'd spent his career in rooms where the lighting was consistently indoor, was looking at Garrett with the careful neutrality of someone who recognized a problem. This facility's military patients are under JSOC operational security, Garrett was saying when Nora arrived. Any federal inquiry into their status requires written authorization through the chain of command. I'm not here about your patients, Sergeant Major. Pembroke's voice was smooth in the way that well-made machinery is smooth, designed to minimize friction in the direction it wanted to move. He looked past Garrett and found Nora, and his eyes changed slightly in the way eyes change when a person locates what they were looking for. I'm here about one of your staff members. Nora kept her face neutral. She had practiced neutral in conditions that made this conversation look comfortable. Mr. Pembroke, she said, I'm Nora Voss. I'm the charge nurse on duty. I know who you are, he said, and then, after a pause that was just long enough, I'm also aware of who you were. The security desk was staffed by a man named Terrence, who was trying very hard to look like he wasn't listening. Dolores had appeared from the corridor behind Nora and stopped 6 feet back, doing the same. If you have business with my staff, Nora said, you can conduct it with HR during business hours. This isn't an HR matter. Then I'd like to understand what authority you're operating under tonight. Pembroke reached inside his jacket and produced a folded document. He held it out, and Nora took it and read it. And when she looked up, her face was still neutral, but something behind her sternum had gone very tight. The document was a federal operational security directive. It cited a classified operation from 4 years ago. It cited her service designation, not her name, just the designation. And it outlined, in the flat language of bureaucratic instruments, a restriction order on any information pertaining to that operation and any personnel involved, including her. It was, in plain terms, a gag order with federal teeth. It was also 4 years old, which meant someone had been sitting on it. This was issued 4 years ago, she said. It was. And you're presenting it now. You came back into a system you were supposed to have left, Ms. Voss. Pembroke's voice didn't change. That creates certain complications that need to be addressed. Garrett had read the document over her shoulder. She felt him go still in the way large structures go still before they move, not relaxing, but loading. That designation, he said, is my operative, under JSOC authority. Sergeant Major, this directive supersedes what operation? Garrett said. What specific operation does that directive cite? Pembroke looked at him. You know I can't discuss that in an unsecured. Then I suggest you get somewhere secured, Garrett said, because in about 30 seconds I'm going to make a phone call that will put people into this conversation who will want to know why a federal security directive pertaining to a JSOC asset is being served in a civilian hospital during an active operational aftermath. His voice hadn't risen. It was very nearly pleasant. And those people are going to want to talk about how that directive came to exist, and why, and who authorized it. For the first time, something moved across Pembroke's face that wasn't controlled. It was brief, a quarter second of something that looked like recalculation, and then it was gone. This doesn't need to be a confrontation, he said. You showed up in a hospital during a storm with a federal order targeting one of my personnel, Garrett said. That's the confrontation. I didn't bring it. Nora had been watching Pembroke's hands during this exchange. They were still, controlled. But his right thumb had moved twice against the side of his index finger in the specific small rhythm of a person who is managing a variable they didn't fully anticipate. She knew that rhythm. She'd seen it in rooms with much higher stakes than this one. Mr. Pembroke, she said, whatever that document is intended to do tonight, it's not going to work the way you want it to. Half a trauma team has seen me work in the last 3 hours. My name is in every chart in those bays. I'm the nurse of record on 2 of your... She glanced at the document, then back up. Operationally sensitive patients. Whatever you came here to put back in the box is already out. Something in his expression shifted. Not defeat. Men like Pembroke didn't show defeat in corridors, but the recalibration of someone whose first approach has encountered unexpected terrain. You understand, he said carefully, That the directive I've shown you carries specific legal... I understand what it says, Nora said. I also understand that a directive issued 4 years ago, citing a classified operation being served on a civilian nurse in a civilian hospital, is going to raise questions about why it exists and why it's being deployed tonight of all nights. She folded the document and held it out to him. And I think you understand that too. He took the document. His hand was steady. We'll continue this conversation, he said. During business hours, Nora said, with HR present, and with whatever legal representation I choose to bring. Pembroke looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Garrett. Then he put the document back inside his jacket and walked toward the exit, and the storm outside swallowed the sound of his footsteps before the door had fully closed. Dolores let out a breath that was approximately 60% of her lung capacity. Garrett turned to Nora. His face was doing the internal processing thing again. You knew who he was before he said anything. I recognized the type. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. Outside, the storm was doing what storms do at their peak. Not violent in the dramatic sense, but relentless. The sound of water and wind that has been ongoing long enough to feel permanent. I recognized his name, she said finally. From 4 years ago. Garrett was quiet for 3 seconds. He was involved. It wasn't a question, so she didn't answer it. Nora. He used her name for the first time. Not Echo, not Voss, just the first name. And the familiarity of it from a man who didn't do familiarity without a reason stopped her. Whatever they covered up, it's coming apart. The fact that he came here tonight, the way he came, means something's already in motion. She looked back toward the corridor, toward Bay 1, toward Martinez's numbers on the monitor, toward Finch's steady presence, toward this building she had quietly made into her life. I have patience, she said. She walked back into the hospital, and the lights held, and the storm pressed against every wall. In the parking structure attached to Harbor Reach Medical Center, on the 3rd level where the security cameras had been malfunctioning for 6 days without being repaired, Arthur Pembroke sat in the back of a black SUV and made a phone call that lasted 4 minutes and contained 3 sentences that mattered. And when he hung up, the look on his face was not the controlled neutrality he'd worn in the lobby. It was something closer to urgency. And somewhere in the same building, in the file room adjacent to the administrator's office, a door that should have been locked was open, and the light inside was on. The file room light was on, and Nora saw it from 30 feet away. She had come back through the main corridor intending to check Martinez, and then find coffee, and then get through the next 3 hours by doing what she had done for 3 years, putting one foot in front of the other and not looking too far ahead. The corridor that ran past the administrator's suite was not on her direct route, but she'd taken it anyway because the direct route went past the bay where Holt was standing, and she needed 4 minutes without his face in her field of vision before she trusted herself to be professional about it. The file room door was 112 feet from the administrator's office. She knew the distance because she had once been someone who measured distances automatically, and that particular habit had not left her the way she'd hoped it would. The door was open 6 inches. The light inside was fluorescent, casting a thin bar of white across the hallway floor. She stopped. The file room contained personnel records, incident documentation, payroll archives, and the physical backup copies of every HR proceeding conducted at Harbor Reach for the past 7 years. It was locked with a keypad. Nora knew the code because she'd been asked to retrieve her own documentation from it twice during her tenure, and the code had been the same both times, which told her something about how seriously the administration took physical security. She pushed the door open with 2 fingers and stood in the doorway. A man was at the cabinet on the far wall, late 30s, unremarkable clothes, no hospital ID. He had a folder open in one hand and a phone raised in the other, photographing the contents page by page with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how much time he had. He heard her and turned. They looked at each other for approximately 1 second. Then he closed the folder, put it back in the drawer, and moved toward her with the specific unhurried walk of someone who has decided that the best cover for being caught is to act like they weren't. Buildings closed to non-staff, Nora said. I got turned around looking for the family waiting area, he said. Storm has the signage all messed up. The folder he'd put back was in the 3rd drawer of the personnel cabinet, the drawer marked with the letter range N through R. Her last name started with V. Family waiting area is the other wing, she said. Security desk can help you find it. He nodded and walked past her and down the corridor, and she watched him go. And she memorized his gait and his height, and the specific way his left shoulder sat slightly higher than his right, which was either an old injury or a habit, and she noted that he didn't ask her which way the security desk was, because he already knew. She went to the cabinet and opened the third drawer. Her file was thicker than it should have been. Not thicker in the way that accumulated paperwork thickens a file. Thicker in the way that means documents have been added that weren't there before. She paged through it fast, the way you read something when you're looking for what doesn't belong, and found it on the fourth page from the back. A printed incident summary dated 8 months ago, citing a medication administration error signed by a physician she had never worked with, for a patient whose room number she didn't recognize. It was fabricated. It was cleanly done, professionally formatted, and completely fabricated. She took out her phone and photographed every page. Then she closed the drawer and went to find Garrett. He was in the family consultation room adjacent to the surgical waiting area, the room that hospitals use when the news is bad or when the people receiving it need to be contained away from the general population. He was sitting in one of the chairs with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, not resting but thinking, the way operators sit when they're between actions and running threat assessments in the space that other people use for relaxing. One of his team, the compact woman with the medical patch, whose name Nora had learned in the past hour, was Torres, was against the wall with her eyes closed, which meant she was either asleep in the 30-second way that some trained people could sleep, or she was listening to everything. Nora held out her phone. Garrett looked at the photographs. His expression didn't change, but his jaw set in a way that was different from its normal set. "This was in your file tonight," he said, "added recently. Possibly tonight, possibly in the past few days. There was a man photographing it when I walked in. He left before I could get a name." Description. She gave it. Torres opened her eyes, which confirmed she had been listening. "Pembroke didn't come alone," Torres said. "No," Garrett said. He stood. "He came to assess the situation. The other one came to handle it." He looked at Nora. "They're building a case to discredit you before whatever comes next." "Before whatever comes next," Nora repeated. "Garrett, what is coming next?" He looked at her steadily. "You were part of Operation Callsign Reach." The name landed in her chest like something physical. She had not heard those words spoken aloud in 4 years. She had not spoken them herself. She had carried them in the specific way you carry things that have no safe place to put down. Not forgotten, not processed, just held. "You know about Callsign Reach," she said. "I know what happened. I know what was reported, and I know those two things aren't the same." He kept his voice low, not because Torres wasn't cleared. She was, or he wouldn't have said the name, but because the room had walls and walls had proximity. "I know 3 operators died in a situation that the after-action report described as unavoidable. I know you were the trauma specialist on the ground, and I know your record was classified and your deployment history was redacted in a way that suggested someone was cleaning a surface rather than filing a report." Nora sat down. She didn't decide to sit. Her legs made the decision, and she followed. "They said the deaths were from wound complications," she said. "That's what went into the record." "I know what went into the record." "The deaths weren't from wound complications." She said it flatly, without effect, because affect would have cost her something she couldn't afford to spend tonight. "They were from a decision made above my level that delayed extraction by 6 hours. I treated 3 critical casualties in a forward position with supplies for 1 for 6 hours, and 2 of them died before the helicopters came. The third died in transit." She looked at the wall. "I filed a full report, a complete report. Everything I treated, every decision, every timeline." "That report doesn't exist in any file I've been able to access," Garrett said. "I know. Someone removed it." "I know that too." She looked back at him. "That's why I left. That's why I became Nora Voss and took a job in a coastal trauma center and spent 3 years being Marcus Holt's favorite problem." She heard the flatness in her own voice and couldn't fix it. "Because the alternative was fighting something I couldn't prove, against people I couldn't name, with a record that had been scrubbed down to almost nothing." Torres had moved to the door. Not leaving. Positioning. Nora registered it. "Pembroke was involved in Callsign Reach," Garrett said. "How was the civilian liaison on the Operational Oversight Committee?" He signed off on the extraction delay. Nora looked at him. I have a source, Garrett said. Someone inside who's been documenting for 2 years. They reached out to JSOC 6 months ago. That's why my team was in the region. We were running a secondary operation that was adjacent to the original site. He paused. Things went sideways on our end, which is why we're here. But the primary reason we were in that operational area at all was related to Callsign Reach. The storm pressed against the building. Somewhere above them, in the structure of the roof, something groaned and held. Your source, Nora said. Do they have the original report? They have documentation of the extraction delay order. They have the communication chain. They have Pembroke's name on a directive that went out 6 hours before extraction that cited a non-existent security threat as justification for holding the helicopters. Nora was quiet for 8 seconds. She was counting, without meaning to, the way she counted in emergency situations. Not measuring time, but anchoring herself to something concrete while her mind moved through the implications at a pace that felt like running. He came here tonight, she said, because someone told him Echo was here. Yes. The contact list. Yes. He wanted to serve the directive before whatever your source is about to release becomes public. That's my assessment. She stood up. Her legs were steadier now than they'd been 60 seconds ago, which was how she knew she'd moved through the initial impact and into the part where you act. Then we have a problem, she said, because the man who was photographing my file is still in this building, and whatever he was adding to it is now part of the physical record. And if Pembroke gets any kind of legal instrument moving before your source goes public, that file is what they'll use. I know. So we need to document what I just found before it can be altered again. I have someone who can... Garrett. She stopped him. I've been a civilian for 3 years. I can't run an operation in my own hospital. I need you to tell me clearly what you can do and what you can't, because I have patients in those bays and I am not leaving this building tonight regardless of what Pembroke does. And if I'm going to be the person whose name is on this when it breaks, I need to know what I'm standing on. He looked at her for a long moment. It was the look of a man who respected someone enough not to give them a comfortable answer. My team is operational but limited, he said. We have Martinez and Rowe in your surgical facilities. I have 3 mobile operators who are functional but not at full capacity. I can make contact with my chain of command, and I can document what you found in that file room. He paused. What I can't do is prevent Pembroke from filing whatever he came here to file. What I can do is make sure that when he does, there are people on the other end of it who are already expecting it. Make the call, Nora said. She left the room and went back to work because the work was what she could control, and control was what she needed. Martinez had been stable for 40 minutes, which in post-penetrating chest trauma was a meaningful number. Finch was still with him, looking tired in the way that young doctors look tired. Not physically depleted, but emotionally pressed, the weight of the night visible around his eyes. He had not left the bay in 3 hours. Go get something to eat, Nora said. I'm fine. You've been on your feet since 6. Martinez is stable. I'll watch him. She looked at Finch directly. 15 minutes. Eat something. He went. She settled into the monitoring chair and watched Martinez breathe, and the room was quiet enough that she could hear the ventilator cycling and the rain on the windows and the distant sound of voices somewhere down the corridor. And she let herself be in this room for a moment. Just in this room, just this patient, just the numbers on the monitor that told her something she needed to know. Martinez's hand moved. Not a spasm, not an involuntary neurological reflex, a deliberate movement, the fingers curling slowly and then releasing. He was surfacing. She put her hand over his. You're in a hospital, she said. You're safe. Don't try to move. His eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, then gradually resolved. The slow blink of someone moving through sedation into wakefulness, assembling the room piece by piece. Echo, he said. It came out rough, barely voiced. Don't talk. Team? Your team is here. Everyone is accounted for. This was close enough to true. Rest. He closed his eyes again. His grip on her hand had not released, and she didn't move it. She stayed like that until Finch came back with a granola bar and slightly better color, and then she went to find Kira. Kira was in the supply corridor refilling a medication cart, and she had the look of someone who had been processing the events of the night in real time, and was somewhere around the 3rd or 4th revision of her understanding of what kind of night this was. The man who came in with the federal ID, Nora said quietly. Did anyone get his name? Dolores wrote it in the visitor log. Pembroke. Kira's voice was careful. Nora, who are these people? People I used to know. That's not an answer. It's the answer I have right now. She picked up a supply bin and held it out. I need you to do something for me. The physical personnel file cabinet, the one in the records room off the administrator's suite. I need you to ask Dolores to formally lock it and note in the building log that a non-credentialed individual was observed in that room tonight at approximately 12:55. Time-stamped entry, her signature. Kira looked at her. That's a security incident report. Yes. If I file that, Holt is going to... Holt isn't the problem tonight, Nora said. File it. Kira took the bin. She looked at Nora for a moment with the expression of someone who has decided to stop asking questions and start trusting, which was its own kind of courage. Okay, she said. The second escalation came at 1:47 in the morning, in the form of a phone call to the nursing station that Dolores took and then walked to find Nora with the particular expression of someone delivering news they don't fully understand but know is significant. There's a Dr. Warren Stills on the line, Dolores said. He says he's with the Navy Medical Inspector General's office. He says he's been trying to reach this facility for 40 minutes, but the storm knocked out the main exchange. He wants to speak to someone in charge about... She looked at the note in her hand. About a documentation request related to patients admitted under classified operational authority. Nora took the phone. The man on the other end of the line was professional and specific, which were the two things you wanted in an IG investigator, and the two things that told her this was not a preliminary inquiry. Ms. Voss, he said. I'll be direct. We have an ongoing investigation into operational record management related to an event 4 years ago. We've been made aware that individuals connected to that event may be present at your facility tonight. We're asking for voluntary cooperation in preserving any documentation related to personnel present at Harbor Reach this evening. That request needs to go through the hospital's legal department, she said. I understand. However, given the hour and the storm, I want to ensure that everyone at your facility understands that any alteration or removal of existing documentation tonight would constitute obstruction, she said. Yes. I'm aware of what it would constitute, she paused. Dr. Stills, how long has this investigation been active? A brief silence. 14 months. 14 months. Garrett had said his source reached out 6 months ago. Someone had been moving on Callsign Reach for longer than she'd known, longer than Garrett had told her, and the shape of what that meant was beginning to assemble itself in her head in a way that made the hairs on her forearms rise. I'll make sure the relevant documentation is secured, she said. You should contact our legal department at 8 a.m. She hung up and stood with the phone in her hand and looked at the wall for 3 seconds. Then she went to find Marcus Holt. He was in his office, not his clinical office off the trauma bay, but his administrative office on the second floor, which meant he'd left the active emergency department during an active mass casualty event to sit in a room with a door he could close, which told her something about what the night had done to him. The door was open. He was at his desk with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a stack of papers he wasn't reading. She knocked on the open door. He looked up. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything. He set down the papers. He didn't invite her in, but he didn't tell her to leave, so she came in and stood in the space between the door and the desk and told him about the file room, about the fabricated incident report, about Pembroke, about the man photographing her personnel documents. She didn't tell him about Callsign Reach because that wasn't his to know yet, and because she needed to see what he did with what she gave him before she decided how much further to go. When she finished, Holt was quiet for a long time. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. It was a nervous gesture. She'd never seen him make a nervous gesture, and it recalibrated her reading of him in a way she hadn't expected. The incident report you found, he said finally. The fabricated one. Yes. I didn't put it there. I didn't say you did. But you thought it. He set the cup down. Voss, the formal review, the Thursday review. I want you to know that was not... He stopped. Started again. I had concerns about a charting discrepancy. I filed those concerns through the appropriate channel. I did not authorize anything to be placed in your personnel file. Someone used your review as cover, she said. They needed a paper trail of institutional questions about my performance before tonight. Your review gave them the context they needed to add fabricated documentation without it looking out of place. He was quiet again. Someone knew, she said. They knew this was going to happen tonight, that those operators were going to end up here, that my connection to them would become visible. They wanted a file on me that would look like a pattern of issues. Holt looked at the papers on his desk. Sheila, he said. Nora went still. Sheila has been... He pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose. There have been conversations about the department, about staffing, about certain personnel decisions being better handled before year end. He looked up. I thought she was managing budget concerns. She was specific about you. She said your file had some issues that needed to be addressed before your contract renewal. When did she tell you that? 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago. Before tonight. Before the storm. Before the helicopters. Someone had known 3 weeks ago that this moment was coming. Someone had told Sheila Okafor, not the surgeon Sheila, the administrator Sheila, the one who managed Holt and protected his decisions and had built the case for Nora's review. Someone had told her in advance, and she had used Holt as the instrument for creating the paper trail they needed. Where is Sheila right now? Nora asked. I don't... He picked up his phone, looked at it. She came in when the storm started. Standard protocol for administrators during mass casualty events. She should be on the 4th floor in emergency operations. Is she? He called the extension. It rang 8 times and went to voicemail. They looked at each other. Nora said, check the file room. She was already moving when Holt pushed back from his desk, and she was in the stairwell before she fully processed what she was moving toward. And she took the stairs at the pace of someone who has stopped calculating risk in favor of reaching a specific location before something irreversible happened. The file room door was closed. The light bar under it was on. She did not go in alone. She pulled out her phone and called Torres because Torres was the person she trusted in this building right now to be in a room she didn't fully control. And Torres answered in one ring and said location, and Nora gave it, and the line went quiet. 2 minutes. She stood in the corridor outside the file room door and listened. From inside, barely audible over the ambient storm noise, the sound of a drawer sliding. Then another. Then the rustle of paper. Torres appeared from the corridor intersection with one of Garrett's other mobile operators, a tall man named Vic, who moved quietly enough that Nora hadn't heard him coming. Torres looked at the door. She looked at Nora. She held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. Nora pushed the door open. Sheila Okafor, the administrator, not the surgeon, and standing in this room at 2 in the morning with a document box on the counter and her hands inside a personnel drawer, turned around. She was not the composed patient services director of 11 years. She was a woman who had been caught in a specific act at a specific moment, and the thing that happened to her face when the door opened was not guilt exactly. It was the rapid reorganization of a person who is already prepared for multiple outcomes and is currently selecting one. I was looking for documentation related to tonight's events, she said, for the incident report. At 2 in the morning, Torres said, the storm has disrupted normal protocols. The box you're standing next to, Nora said, has my name on it. Sheila looked at the box. There was a pause that lasted long enough to mean something. I think, Sheila said carefully, that you've misread this situation. Put the box down, Nora said. Sheila set it on the counter. Her hands were steady. Nora noted that the hands were steady, which meant this woman had prepared for the possibility of being caught and had a response ready, and the response was going to be calm and articulate and institutional, and it was going to be very difficult to counter with anything except what Nora already had in her phone. Ms. Okafor, Torres said, and her voice had the flat authority of someone who did not need volume to convey intent. I'd like you to step away from the cabinet. You have no authority here. No. But the Navy Medical Inspector General's office does, and they called this facility 40 minutes ago. Torres looked at her steadily. I was in the room. Something shifted in Sheila's face. The prepared response encountered something it hadn't fully accounted for, and for just a moment, half a second, the length of a blink, the composure broke, and what was underneath it was visible. It was not guilt. It was calculation, and underneath the calculation, it was fear. Nora looked at the document box on the counter. Then she looked at Sheila. Then she said quietly, "Who told you I would be here tonight?" Sheila said nothing. "Who told you 3 weeks ago that my file needed to be prepared?" Still nothing. "It wasn't Pembroke," Nora said. "Pembroke is operational. He doesn't make personnel decisions. Whoever told you came to you because you had access to the file system and a reason to act on it." She stepped forward. "Who called you, Sheila?" And Sheila Okafor, who had been the administrator of Harbor Reach Medical Center for 11 years and had managed doctors and budgets and crises with the particular confidence of a person who always knew which side of the room to stand on, looked at Nora Voss and said, "You can't touch him." The storm outside hit a pitch that made the lights flicker. "Who?" Nora said. Sheila pressed her lips together. She had said too much and she knew it, and she was trying to retract it with silence, but silence after those 4 words was its own kind of answer. From down the corridor, moving fast, came the sound of footsteps. More than one person, moving with purpose. Torres turned toward the sound. Nora stayed looking at Sheila. "You can't touch him," Sheila said again, and this time it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like she was trying to convince herself. The footsteps reached the corridor junction, and Garrett came around the corner with Vic, a half step behind and a third person between them. A man in a suit that was not the same man as Pembroke, older, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in rooms where other people stood when he entered. Nora didn't recognize his face, but she recognized the insignia on the lapel of his jacket, the small, precise pin that denoted a specific federal oversight committee, the committee that had existed for exactly one purpose 4 years ago, the committee whose name appeared on 3 documents in an operation file that was supposed to have been destroyed. She had last seen that insignia in a forward operating base outside a city she was not permitted to name, 6 hours before 3 men died. He looked at her across the file room doorway, and something in his expression told her that he had been expecting this moment for 4 years and had been confident until approximately tonight that it would never actually arrive. "Ms. Voss," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it. "Senator Graves," she said. The senator looked older than she remembered, which was either the years or the lighting or the specific way a person ages when they've been carrying something heavy for a long time and have stopped being able to pretend it isn't heavy. He was 71 now. She'd done the math before, in the early months after she left, in the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning when she couldn't sleep and her mind moved through the event the way tongues move through the space where a tooth used to be. Senator Randall Graves, Senate Armed Services Committee, Subcommittee on Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict. The man who had the authority to delay a helicopter extraction for 6 hours and the institutional cover to describe that delay as a security precaution in every official document that followed. He was looking at her the way people look at something they had convinced themselves no longer existed. "I think," he said, "we should speak privately." "I don't," Garrett said. Graves looked at him with the measured patience of a man who had been managing other people's interruptions for 4 decades. "Sergeant Major, I understand your team has been through a significant operational event tonight. I'm not here in any adversarial capacity. I'm here because I became aware that you became aware that your man Pembroke had a problem," Torres said from the far side of the room. She hadn't moved from her position near the cabinet. "And you came to assess whether the problem was manageable." Something moved through Graves's expression. Not anger. Anger would have been more honest. It was a kind of controlled disappointment, the expression of a man who preferred his conversations to move along tracks he'd laid in advance. "Ms. Voss," he said, looking back at Nora, "I would like the opportunity to explain the circumstances surrounding Callsign Reach, in full, to you, directly." "You had 4 years," she said. "There were complications. 3 men died. Those are the complications I'm aware of." The hallway was very still. Outside the file room, in the corridor, Nora could hear the storm cycling down from its peak, not ending, but losing the edge of its worst intensity, that particular quality of weather when it has done its maximum damage and is beginning to breathe out. Inside the room, the fluorescent light buzzed on its usual frequency, and the personnel cabinet stood with its drawer still slightly open, and the document box sat on the counter with her name facing outward. Sheila had not moved. She was standing against the side wall with her arms at her sides and the expression of a woman who has understood, in the past 90 seconds, that the side she had chosen was losing ground. "There's a naval IG investigator who has been building a case for 14 months, Nora said. His name is Warren Stills. He called this facility tonight. He asked for cooperation in preserving documentation. She watched Graves's face. You know his name. I'm aware of the investigation. Are you aware that Stills has the communication chain from the night of the delay? The directive Pembroke signed? The timestamp that shows the security threat cited as justification was logged 3 hours after the directive went out. Graves didn't answer. His hands were at his sides, and Nora watched them the way she'd watched Pembroke's hands in the lobby, looking for the small involuntary movements that told her more than the face. His left hand closed once, opened. The investigation is proceeding through appropriate channels, he said. My concern tonight is ensuring that whatever information exists at this facility is handled with the appropriate level of classification. The information at this facility, Garrett said, includes a fabricated incident report in Ms. Voss's personnel file, which was placed there recently, and a non-credentialed individual who was photographing that file earlier tonight. He paused. That information has already been documented and transmitted. Anything in this room right now is a secondary record. Graves went very still. It was a different kind of stillness from Sheila's or from Pembroke's controlled recalibration. This was the stillness of a man who has just understood that the terrain he thought he was walking on has already shifted under his feet without his knowledge. Transmitted to whom? He asked. To my chain of command, Garrett said, which means it's already outside any jurisdiction you hold. The senator looked at the document box on the counter. He looked at Sheila. He looked finally at Nora. And what was in his face now was not the politician's careful management, but something underneath it, the residue of a decision made 4 years ago in a forward operating base when the calculus of a covert operation was weighed against 3 men's lives and the calculus had won. I didn't want them to die, he said. It was such a plain sentence that it landed wrong in the room, too small for the space it needed to fill. I know, Nora said. She said it quietly, and meant it, and hated that she meant it, because the truth about men like Graves was not that they were monsters, but that they were the more difficult thing, men who made terrible decisions for reasons they could justify to themselves, and who then spent years constructing the institutional architecture that kept the justification intact. But they did, and you buried the report that said why. He looked at the floor. I need you to step away from this room, Garrett said to Graves. Both of you. This last part was directed at Sheila. This space is now a preserved evidence location. We'll need to document what's in this cabinet before anything leaves it. Graves looked up. He was assembling something. Not a rebuttal, but a posture. The specific adjustment of a man who has accepted a loss and is already calculating what comes next. I'll cooperate with the Inspector General's office, he said. I want that on record. Make sure Stills hears it, Nora said. Not me. He nodded once, stiffly, and walked out of the room. His footsteps in the corridor were slower than when he'd arrived. Sheila followed. She didn't look at Nora on the way out. She looked at the floor and kept her arms pressed to her sides and walked with the particular quality of a person who is very carefully not running. Torres let out a slow breath. Well, she said. Don't, Garrett said. I wasn't going to say anything good. Nora looked at the document box on the counter, at the cabinet with the drawer open, at the room that had just been the center of something she was still only partially able to process. I need to go check on my patients, she said. Garrett nodded. He was already on his phone. She went back to the emergency floor and spent 40 minutes doing exactly that. Martinez had stayed stable through the confrontation in the file room, which was the kind of fact that the part of her brain that never fully left the clinical space registered with something close to gratitude. His pressure was holding. His breath sounds were bilaterally present and improving. He was in and out of light sedation, surfacing periodically to confirm through a hand grip or a word that he was present, and each time he surfaced, Finch was there to keep him from fighting the IV lines. Rowe was out of surgery and in recovery. Okafor, the surgeon, the one who operated under fluorescent lights and made the work look like controlled inevitability, had come to find Nora at 3 a.m. with her scrub cap still on and reported a successful repair, grade 2 laceration, no secondary complications, expected full recovery. She said it in the flat, efficient way of surgeons giving operative reports, and then she said, in a different register, I've been thinking about what I said to you earlier tonight. You don't have to. I put a formal note in the record, Okafor said, about the audit log. About the timestamp discrepancy on the charting modification. I did it an hour ago, and I sent a copy to the department head at Carolina's Health, who is not Marcus Holt. She looked at Nora steadily. I should have done it weeks ago. I want you to know I'm aware of that. Nora looked at her. Thank you. Don't thank me. I'm 52 years old, and I've been practicing in this system for a long time, and I have managed other people's bullying with patients for most of that time, because patience felt like strategy. Okafor pulled her cap off and folded it in her hands. It isn't. It's just patience. She walked away. Nora watched her go. By 4 in the morning, the storm had dropped from its operational intensity to something merely persistent. Heavy rain, sustained wind, the particular exhausted quality of weather that has given everything it had and is now running out the remainder. The ER had thinned from its peak chaos to a manageable volume. The overnight staff had absorbed the mass casualty event and kept the ordinary emergencies moving through. And what Nora found when she looked at the floor with fresh eyes was a department that had performed well under conditions it hadn't been designed for. She found Kira in the break room at 4:15, sitting with both hands around a coffee cup, staring at nothing. The security incident report, Nora said. Did Dolores file it? Filed and timestamped at 1:42. Kira looked up. There's a federal person in the administrator's conference room, has been for the last hour. Dolores said he has identification from the IG's office. Stills. He'd made it to the building. Is Holt with him? Holt went home at 3:30. Kira paused. He came and found me before he left. He said to tell you that he was withdrawing the formal review. He said he'd document it first thing in the morning. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. He looked, I don't know, he looked like someone who found out the floor he'd been standing on was made of something different than he thought. Did he say anything else? He said he was sorry. Kira looked at her. That's all. He said it and then he left. Nora sat down across from her. The break room was small, and the fluorescent light above the microwave was flickering in its slow, dying way that it had been doing for 6 months without anyone putting in a maintenance request, and the room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular institutional combination of sanitizer and recycled air that she had stopped noticing 3 years ago. Nora, Kira said, are you okay? She thought about the question. It was not a question she was equipped to answer in full at 4:15 in the morning after the kind of night this had been, so she answered the part of it she could reach. I will be, she said. Not right now, but I will be. The next escalation came not as a confrontation, but as a document. At 5:47 in the morning, as the storm became rain and the rain became something a person could stand in without being afraid of it, Dr. Warren Stills came to find Nora. He was shorter than his voice suggested, compact, maybe 50, with the look of someone who had spent a career reading things carefully and had developed the specific squint of a person who does not accept a summary when the original is available. He had a folder under his arm, and he had found her in the corridor outside the recovery bay, and he said her name, and she stopped and turned. I want to show you something, he said, before this goes further. He opened the folder. Inside was a document she had never seen, but whose existence she had believed in the way you believe in things you need to be true in order to keep functioning. Her original after-action report from Callsign Reach. All 14 pages of it, her name at the top, her signature at the bottom, and in between, a complete accounting of every decision made and every decision denied to her on the night. 3 men died. Her handwriting. Her words. The timestamp she had documented in a forward position with a pen and a notebook because the digital systems had been down, which meant the original had been a physical document, which meant someone had preserved it in paper form for 4 years, which meant, who kept this? She asked. The operator who was your primary contact on the ground that night, Stills said. He made a copy before he was debriefed. He's been holding it. A pause. He came forward 6 months ago. She looked at the report, at her own handwriting, the shorthand she'd used under fire, the abbreviations she'd developed during 3 years of forward medical operations, the specific notation she'd used for time of deterioration that no one who hadn't worked alongside her would have been able to replicate or fabricate. He's willing to testify, Stills said. He'd be testifying against a sitting senator. He's aware of that. She looked up. Why now? Why did he come forward now? Stills was quiet for a moment. Because Martinez was on that operation, he said. The man in your bay right now. He was junior then. lowest-ranking member on the ground. He was the one who made it out the fastest because of his position when the helicopters finally came. He looked at the folder. He's been living with it for 4 years. When the team started working the adjacent operation and the Callsign Reach documentation came up in the secondary intelligence, he made the decision that he was done living with it. Nora looked through the window into the recovery bay. Martinez was visible on the other side of the glass, stable, present, his numbers steady on the monitor above the bed. He came to this facility tonight, she said slowly, not just because the storm diverted the helicopters. The secondary contact list that had your name flagged, Stills said. Martinez asked for it to be flagged 18 months ago. He didn't know what would come of it. He just wanted it there in case. The corridor was very quiet. The storm was rain now. The building was breathing at its recovery pace. Not the held breath tension of the peak hours, but the slow decompression of a structure that has been through something and is still standing. I want to be clear about something, Stills said. The investigation has sufficient material to proceed without your testimony. The communication chain, the delay directive, the original after-action report, it's enough. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. He paused. But if you're willing to make a formal statement, I'm willing, she said. He nodded once. He had the look of a man who had been hoping for that answer without letting himself assume it. There's one more thing, he said, and this was where his voice changed slightly. Not softer exactly, but differently careful. The fabricated incident report in your file. We've traced the origin of the document template to a federal contractor currently employed under a subcommittee that Senator Graves chairs. He let that settle. It wasn't just preparation against you specifically tonight. There's a pattern. 3 other former operatives in civilian positions have had similar documents appear in their employment files in the past 18 months. She stared at him. A systematic effort, he said, to pre-discredit potential witnesses before the investigation went public. The shape of it. The full shape. Not the piece she'd been standing inside, but the whole architecture of it, assembled itself in her head in a way that made the floor feel briefly different under her feet. Graves hadn't just buried Callsign Reach. He'd been maintaining it, actively, for 4 years, monitoring the people who'd been there, positioning instruments, Pembroke, Sheila, others she didn't know about, to manage the moment this surface cracked. He knew this was coming, she said. He's known for 18 months, since the first source came forward. Stills closed the folder. He's been managing it the way he managed the original event, by controlling the information on the ground before it could become official. And tonight he came here himself, she said, which is either a sign that he's confident or a sign that he's losing control of the pieces. She thought about the way he'd looked in the file room doorway, about the senator's pin on his lapel and the 4 years behind his eyes and the plain sentence, "I didn't want them to die," that had been too small for what it needed to cover. It's the second one, she said. The sun came up at 6:48, or rather the sky became light in the specific way it becomes light after a storm. Gray first, then a kind of washed pewter, then a gradual filtering of color that didn't look like dawn so much as like the world running a diagnostic to see what was still there. Nora was on the roof. Not the helicopter pad, that was procedurally closed after the overnight landings, and there were maintenance personnel up there assessing the surface. She was on the east-facing access walkway, the one that looked out over the harbor and the hospital's maintenance structures, and beyond them, the gray-green water that was still running high from the storm surge. She had her phone in her hand. She had been standing there for 6 minutes. She called a number she had not called in 4 years. It rang 3 times. "Voss," said the voice on the other end. It was not a question. "Reardon," she said. Specialist First Class Dana Riordan had been her forward medical assistant during Callsign Reach. She had survived the 6-hour delay in the extraction window by virtue of not having been critically injured at the start of it, and she had been the person who helped Nora keep the other 3 alive for as long as they were kept alive, and she had been processed back through the system and quietly discharged 18 months after the operation with a separation package and a non-disclosure form that Nora had always suspected was more binding than standard. "I heard you had a busy night," Reardon said. "Martinez is stable." "Good." A brief pause. "I know about Stills. He talked to me 4 months ago." "Why didn't you sit?" "Because I didn't know if you were ready. And because I didn't know if telling you would help or just reopen something that needed more time." Another pause. Are you ready? Nora looked at the harbor. A pelican was sitting on a piling below, indifferent to the storm aftermath, doing the specific pelican thing of existing entirely in the present tense. I've been ready for 4 years, she said. I was just waiting for someone to build a door. Stills built a door. He did? Then go through it. Riordan's voice had the particular texture of a person who has made peace with something at considerable cost and is now on the other side of the cost. I'll send my statement directly to his office today. I'll send everything I kept. A pause. I kept a lot, Nora. After she hung up, she stood for another 3 minutes with the wind from the harbor moving through her hair and the smell of salt and wet concrete and the particular aftermath smell of a storm that has ended. Then she went back inside. By 9 in the morning, the hospital had the quality of the morning after. Reduced staff moving through echoing corridors, the mechanical sounds of the building running its recovery checks, the slow return of the ordinary. The overnight patients had been handed off. The storm casualties had been processed, treated, and mostly discharged or transferred. In the recovery bay, Martinez had his eyes open and was complaining about the IV angle in his hand, which Finch, who had stayed the entire night and looked like he'd been assembled from the leftover parts of a more functional person, was adjusting with the patience of someone running on less sleep than human beings were designed to operate on. Garrett found Nora in the nursing station. He stood on the other side of the counter and looked at her across it, the way he'd looked across distances all night, as a person who was never not assessing, but also, underneath the assessment, as someone who had found what he'd been carrying longer than he'd realized. Ro is asking for you, he said. Tell him I'll come by. Martinez says thank you. Tell him to focus on his respiratory exercises. Garrett almost smiled. It was a minimal expression, a single degree of shift at the corner of his mouth, but she'd been reading people for long enough to catch it. Stills is filing the formal evidence preservation order this morning, he said. It names Graves, Pembroke, and 3 others. The subcommittee aide who sourced the fabricated template, a records management contractor, and Sheila Okafor. Nora nodded. Sheila didn't know what she was in until she was in it, she said. Someone used her access and her grievance with the department to position her. That doesn't exonerate her. No, it explains her. She looked at the nursing station desk, at the charts stacked in the to-be-filed tray, at the coffee cup someone had left beside the phone, at the ordinary surface of the work she'd come back to every day for 3 years. Where's Pembroke? Left the building at approximately 3:15. My understanding is that federal marshals would like to speak with him at some point today. Garrett's voice was neutral on this. He'll have lawyers. It'll take time. It always takes time. It does. He put his hands flat on the counter. For what it's worth, what you did last night, in those bays, under those conditions, without knowing what was coming through the door, that was the best trauma work I've seen in a field context. And I've seen a lot of field contexts. She looked at him. That's not a compliment in place of an apology, he said. I'm going to say the other things separately. I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry the system let what happened to your record happen. I'm sorry I didn't look for Echo when Echo disappeared because I should have. She held his gaze. You found me eventually. Martinez found you. I just followed his navigation. She thought about that. About the man in the recovery bay who had been junior on the ground 4 years ago and had spent the time since carrying a decision he'd made to preserve her name, just in case. About the weight of things carried quietly. I should go check on him, she said. One more thing. Garrett reached into his jacket and put a folded piece of paper on the counter. That's a preliminary record restoration request. It would put your military service history back into the official record, corrected, complete, with the deployment timeline accurately documented. It requires your signature before it can proceed. He left his hand on it for a moment. No timeline. That's yours when you're ready for it. She looked at the paper. Didn't pick it up. How long will the full investigation take? She asked. Stills thinks 6 to 8 months before any formal proceedings. These things move at their own pace. And in the meantime, you go to work. You're a nurse at Harbor Reach Medical Center. He paused. Although I suspect Harbor Reach Medical Center is going to have some conversations about its departmental leadership in the near future, given that its trauma director withdrew a formal review under circumstances that are now part of a federal evidence record. She picked up the paper. She didn't unfold it. She just held it. I'll call you, Garrett said. When things move, you'll have notice. He walked out of the nursing station and down the corridor toward the recovery bay, and she stood with the folded paper in her hand and the morning light coming through the windows at the end of the hall. Actual light now, pale yellow, through the post-storm cloud cover, the first direct light she'd seen since the previous afternoon. She put the paper in her pocket. At 10:14, Marcus Holt returned to the hospital. He came in through the main entrance and not the physician's entrance, which was unusual for him, and he came without his standard arrival energy. The brisk, decisive pace, the briefcase position, the overall quality of a man entering a space that was organized around his authority. He came in the way people come in when they're not sure of their footing, and he came directly to the nursing station. Nora was writing up the overnight summary. She didn't stop writing. The review withdrawal is documented, he said. I filed it with HR and copied the department head at the network level. He paused. I've also filed a separate incident report citing the charting modification timestamp discrepancy that you raised. I've asked IT to audit the credential access logs for the relevant date and to report the findings to the department head. She finished her sentence before she looked up. Thank you. The federal investigation. He stood with his hands at his sides. I didn't know about any of that. I want you to understand that. Sheila managed me. I know. I'm not asking you to... He stopped, started again. I spent 11 years in this department telling myself that high standards and personal convenience were the same thing, that the people I pushed out or cut down deserved it because the environment demanded it. His voice was not comfortable with what it was doing. You never deserved any of it. She looked at him. He looked back. He was not a comfortable man in this moment, and she did not move to make him more comfortable, but she also did not add to his discomfort, because discomfort of this kind was not something she wanted to perform. The department has work to do today, she said. So do I. He nodded once. He picked up the patient census sheet from the station desk, the one that showed current capacity and acuity levels, and looked at it. Then he put it back down and walked toward his office, and the walk was not the walk he'd come in with yesterday morning during rounds. At 11:30, Kira appeared at the nursing station doorway, holding a printed email. This came through the department head's office, she said. Her voice had the quality of someone who doesn't quite believe what they're reading. It's addressed to the clinical staff of the ER department. She held it out. Nora read it. It was from the regional network's chief medical officer. It cited the overnight events at Harbor Reach. It cited the performance of the nursing staff under mass casualty conditions during an active tropical storm. It cited specifically the clinical decision-making of a senior nurse whose quick assessment and intervention had stabilized multiple critical patients in the early hours of the event. It did not use her name, but the description was not ambiguous. It closed by noting that a formal clinical commendation would be issued following review of the overnight records, and that the network was grateful for the quality of care provided during a difficult and unusual situation. Kira was watching her face. The IG thing is going to get bigger, Nora said. When it does, this hospital is going to be in the middle of it. You should be prepared for that. Are you prepared for it? Nora folded the email and set it on the desk. I've been preparing for it for 4 years, she said. She went back to the patient floor, and the morning moved the way mornings move in hospitals, with the particular cadence of handoffs and assessments and the low-grade urgency of the ongoing that never fully stops. And she moved through it doing what she had always done, which was the work, which was the thing she'd come here to do and had kept doing even when everything around the work was designed to make her stop. At 12:45, her phone buzzed. A message from a number she didn't recognize with a Maryland area code. It said, "The directive has been formally rescinded as of 1100 hours this date by order of the Inspector General's office. You should know." She read it twice. Then she put the phone in her pocket and went to check on Martinez. He was sitting up, not fully upright. The chest tube was still in, and he was working around it with the careful economy of a man who understood his own limits. But sitting, which was different from the prone stillness she'd been monitoring all night. He looked at her when she came in. "You saved my life," he said. "You survived," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. He had dark eyes and the face of someone who had been outside for most of his adult life, and there was something in his expression that she recognized because she'd seen it before in the specific context of people who have made it through something they weren't certain they would make it through. Not relief exactly, but the complicated thing that lives on the other side of relief, where you have to start reckoning with what it means that you're still here. I kept your report, he said. 4 years. I kept it. I know. I didn't know if it would matter. It did, she said. It does. He nodded. He looked at the window, the south-facing window that showed the harbor, running lower now, the storm surge receding, the water returning to its ordinary level. The Pelican was probably still on the piling. She didn't know for certain, but she thought it probably was. The guy who delayed the extraction, Martinez said. Graves. He's cooperating with the investigation. How voluntary is that cooperation? She thought about the senator's face in the file room doorway, about the 4-year-old directive being formally rescinded at 11 in the morning, about the way a man's architecture collapses when the foundation goes. Increasingly voluntary, she said. Martinez almost smiled. It reached his eyes more than it reached his mouth, which was the honest version. She checked his tube, confirmed his vitals, adjusted the flow rate on his supplemental oxygen, and was about to leave when he said her name. Not Voss. Not Echo. Nora, he said. She turned. There's something else, he said. Something Stills didn't tell you yet because he wanted to confirm it first. He shifted carefully against the incline of the bed. Graves didn't act alone on the delay. We always knew that. The committee structure meant there were other signatures. But in the past 72 hours, Stills's office received documentation that one of the other signatures was a current JSOC oversight official. He watched her face. Someone inside the system, not retired, active. She went still. They've been inside the investigation from the start, Martinez said. Garrett doesn't know yet. Nobody's told him because they're not sure how high it goes or whether anyone on his current team is connected. He looked at her steadily. I'm telling you because you're not in the chain, and because you need to know before whatever happens today happens. She looked at him, at the window, at the harbor returning to ordinary. Who? She asked. He told her. And the name he said was one she had spoken to directly, less than 8 hours ago, in this building, in the hours when she'd believed the architecture of what was happening around her was finally coming clear. The name was Stills. Warren Stills. The Navy Medical Inspector General investigator who had called the hospital at 40 minutes past midnight, who had arrived in the building before dawn with a folder containing her original after-action report, who had told her the investigation had sufficient material to proceed, who had shown her the communication chain and the delay directive and the fabricated document template, and who had, in doing all of this, positioned himself as the person through whom all of it flowed. The person who knew, before anyone else, exactly what evidence existed and where it lived and who held it. She stood very still next to Martinez's bed and let the information settle into its correct place. And the picture that assembled itself was not complicated once you had the right piece. An investigator running a 14-month case into a classified operation would know every source, every document, every individual who had come forward. He would know Riordan's name. He would know what she was holding. He would know the operator who had kept the original report for 4 years and would have access to that man's identity through the source interview process. And he would know, the moment a JSOC team was diverted to Harbor Reach in a storm, that the situation had changed from manageable to urgent. He had called the hospital before he arrived. She had taken that call. She had told him the documentation was secured. She had told him she'd cooperate with a formal statement. She had given him a complete picture of exactly what was in this building. How long have you known? She asked Martinez. 72 hours. The documentation came through a back channel, someone inside Stills's office, who noticed anomalies in the case file management. Pages accessed outside normal review sequences. Sourced information pulled on dates that didn't match any scheduled interview. He watched her face. The IG's office has its own internal affairs function. They opened a parallel track without Stills knowing. Who else knows? Garrett's chain of command was notified 2 hours ago. Not Garrett directly, because they needed to assess who on his current team might have overlap with Stills's access. Martinez shifted. The movement cost him something. She saw it cross his face and pass. But Garrett is smart enough to have figured it out by now on his own. She was already moving. She found Garrett in the corridor outside the recovery wing, standing with his back to the wall and his phone in his hand, And the look on his face when he saw her was the look of a man who had arrived at the same conclusion from a different direction. "You know," she said, "just confirmed." He held up his phone. 20 minutes ago. My CO called. "Where's Stills?" "That's the question." Garrett's voice had the flat quality of someone containing something large. "He was in the administrator's conference room as of approximately 90 minutes ago. He's not there now. His vehicle is still in the parking structure." "He's still in the building." "That's my assessment." She thought about what Stills had access to. The formal evidence preservation order he'd filed, or said he'd filed. The chain of custody on the documents from the file room. The original after-action report, which he had shown her and which she had held in her hands, and which was now, as far as she knew, back in his folder. "The report," she said. "The original. The physical copy." Garrett's jaw set. "We need to find him." They moved together through the hospital. Not running, because running in a hospital corridor changes the quality of every room you pass, and she didn't want the floor staff in emergency response mode before she understood what she was responding to. They moved at the pace of people with a destination, which is its own kind of visible urgency. Torres fell in from a side corridor without being called. She had the specific quality of someone who had never fully stood down from the previous night. "South stairwell," Torres said quietly. "Security camera caught him 8 minutes ago heading toward the loading dock level." The loading dock level of Harbor Reach Medical Center was where the supply deliveries came in, where the medical waste went out, where the service vehicles parked. It was also, Nora knew from 3 years of working in this building, the level where the cell signal was worst, where the security camera coverage had the most gaps, and where a person could make a phone call or transfer a document or simply wait for a vehicle without being easily observed. They took the south stairwell. She heard him before she saw him. His voice was low and controlled, the same professional register he'd used on the phone at midnight and in person before dawn. And he was speaking to someone she couldn't hear, and he had his back to the stairwell door and his phone pressed to his ear and the folder tucked under his left arm. Torres went right. Garrett went left. Nora came through the center because the center was the direction that would reach him first, and because she understood, in the specific way she understood physical spaces, that the geometry of this moment mattered. He heard her footsteps and turned. The look on his face lasted about 1 second before his professional containment reasserted itself. And in that 1 second, she saw the calculation happen. The rapid assessment of what she knew and how she knew it and what his options were. It was the same calculation she'd seen on Pembroke's face in the lobby and on Graves's face in the file room, and it had the same outcome: insufficient runway. "Ms. Voss," he said. "Dr. Stills." She stopped 6 feet from him. "I'd like the original report back." He looked at her. He looked at Garrett and Torres flanking him from the sides. He looked at the folder under his arm. The investigation, the parallel internal affairs track within the IG's office, was notified 2 hours ago, Garrett said from his right. "They have your case file access logs. They have the source information pull dates." He paused. "They're going to want that document as part of their own evidence chain, not yours." Stills was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he held out the folder. Torres took it. She opened it, confirmed the report was inside, closed it. She looked at Garrett and nodded. "There's a team coming to meet you," Garrett said to Stills. Not unkindly, which was its own kind of precision. "I'd ask you to wait here." Stills looked at the folder in Torres's hands. He looked at Nora. "I didn't want the investigation to fail," he said. "I want you to understand that. I was trying to... There were people who needed protecting, people still inside who would be exposed if the case moved too fast, too publicly. The people you were protecting," Nora said, "are the same people who signed the directive that held those helicopters. Trying to manage the pace of the investigation to protect them isn't protecting the investigation. It's protecting them." He looked at the floor. "The men who died," she said. "They don't get a managed pace. They don't get protected from exposure." She left him there with Torres to wait for the team that was coming, and she walked back up the stairs with Garrett, and neither of them said anything until they reached the second-floor landing, and he pushed open the door and held it, and she walked through. "Is the report secure?" she asked. "Torres will make sure of it." He let the door close behind them. "The parallel track has everything Stills filed, including the evidence preservation order. They'll verify what was actually filed versus what he told you was filed." He paused. "It may mean some delays. Some parts of the chain will need to be re-verified through a clean conduit." How long? Weeks, not months. The core evidence is solid. Stills compromised the management process, not the underlying documentation. He looked at her directly. The case still holds, Nora. It still holds. She leaned against the stairwell wall for a moment. Just a moment. The concrete was cold through her scrubs and the building hummed its mechanical hum around her, and she let herself be tired for the length of that moment. Genuinely, thoroughly tired. The kind that had been accumulating since the previous morning and had been running on suppressed adrenaline since 11 o'clock the previous night. Then she pushed off the wall and went back to work. The afternoon moved. Stills was collected by 2 federal agents at 1:30 and escorted from the building with the quiet efficiency of a process that had been prepared in advance. No one on the floor staff except Dolores saw it happen, and Dolores processed it with the equanimity of a woman who had been a charge nurse for 22 years and had developed the capacity to absorb almost any institutional event without visible disruption. "Do I want to know?" Dolores asked Nora. "Eventually," Nora said. "Not today." "Fair enough." Dolores picked up her clipboard. "Martinez is asking about solid food. Roe's asking about his phone. And there's a man from the network's medical affairs office in the conference room who wants to speak with you at your convenience." "Tell him an hour," Nora said. "I have patience." She did have patience. She had Martinez and Roe and 2 storm casualties still in observation and a post-surgical case from the night before who needed a wound assessment, and a 17-year-old with a broken wrist from a storm-related fall who was scared and hadn't slept, and whose parents hadn't been able to reach the hospital until the roads cleared at noon. She spent 40 minutes with that last patient, more than the clinical situation strictly required, because the girl's fear was real and specific and the kind that doesn't respond to being rushed. And because Nora had learned over 3 years of civilian medicine that the thing medicine most often underbudgets is time. The girl's name was Petra. She had red hair and the kind of precise vocabulary that suggested she read a lot, and she asked, while Nora was checking the cast edges, "Are you the nurse who helped all the soldiers last night?" "I helped some people last night," Nora said. "I'm always helping people. That's the job." Petra looked at her. "My mom said the nurses here were incredible. Like, in the middle of the worst storm in 5 years, they just kept going." Nora checked the distal pulse below the cast. "Good circulation. No compartment concerns." "That's what nurses do," she said. "You'll be okay." The medical affairs representative from the network was a man named Gordon Adler, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the careful precision of someone who worked in a system that had learned to be careful about precision. He had a printed summary of the overnight events that ran to 11 pages, and he had read all of them, and he asked her to walk him through her clinical decisions from the moment the helicopters landed. She did. She was accurate and specific, and she did not editorialize, and she did not perform humility, which was different from having it. At the end of it, he said, "The network is going to issue a formal clinical commendation, with your name on it this time." He looked at her over his glasses. "I want to be transparent with you. There's going to be press interest. The federal investigation, once it becomes public, will name this hospital and the events of last night. The network's communications team is going to want to discuss how you'd like to handle that." "I'll speak with them," she said. "On my terms." "Of course." He made a note. "There's also, and I want to be sensitive about how I raise this, a question of your current departmental position. Given the circumstances of the formal review that was withdrawn, and given what the audit log has now confirmed about the charting modification, the network would like to discuss a formal correction to your employment record and a review of your current role." She looked at him. "What kind of review?" "The kind that might result in a different title," he said, "and a different set of responsibilities." She thought about what that meant, about what she was being offered and what she'd have to decide it meant. "Give me a few weeks," she said. He nodded, like that was the answer he'd expected. Garrett came to find her at 4 in the afternoon, when the day shift was winding toward its handoff, and the floor had the golden hour quality of a hospital settling into its evening rhythm. He was leaving. His mobile operators were ready. Martinez and Roe would remain at Harbor Reach until they were stable for transfer. 3 more days, estimated, based on Okafor's post-operative projections. But the rest of the team had a debrief to get to, and a chain of command that had been patient about the detour that the storm had forced. He stood at the nursing station and put out his hand. She shook it. "The record restoration request," he said. When you're ready. I know. You don't have to do anything with it. He looked at her steadily. But I want you to know that the people who buried your record, that decision is going to be part of the public record of this investigation. Whether you file the restoration or not, the truth of what your service was is going to exist in an official document. She thought about that. About the difference between a record that was accurate and a record that was restored. About whether there was a difference that mattered, and if so, to whom. What would you do? She asked. He considered. I'd file it. Not because I needed it, but because the people who worked alongside you deserve to have the true record be the official one. He paused. The ones who didn't make it home, they should be in a file that tells the truth about why. She looked at the nursing station desk. Okay, she said. He nodded. Torres appeared from down the corridor with the two mobile operators behind her, and the team moved through the hospital the way they'd come in, with the particular efficiency of people for whom moving is second nature. Except that this time they used the front entrance and the weather outside was light rain and reasonable wind, and the parking lot was visible and the sky was high and pale. At the door, Torres turned back. You know what I kept thinking all night? Torres said, while you were running those bays. What? That you were the quietest person in the room, every time. She tilted her head slightly. Not because you were holding back, because you didn't need the noise. She went out the door before Nora could respond. 3 weeks later, the Senate Armed Services Committee opened a formal inquiry into the conduct of its members regarding classified operation management and the handling of post-operation reporting. The inquiry cited Callsign Reach by name in its public announcement, which was the first time that operation had existed in any public-facing document. Senator Randall Graves did not wait for the inquiry's findings. He announced his resignation from the committee on the morning of the same day, citing health concerns, in the specific language of a man whose lawyers had advised him to cite health concerns. The announcement ran for 2 news cycles before the full scope of the inquiry documentation became available to the press, at which point the health concerns became a secondary story. Pembroke was charged with federal records obstruction and conspiracy. His cooperation agreement, filed the same week, named 4 additional individuals connected to the post-operation cover-up, including the records management contractor who had built the fabricated incident report template. Sheila Okafor resigned from her position as Harbor Reach's patient services director before the hospital's board could convene the review that was coming. She retained a lawyer. The outcome of that process would take longer than the immediate news cycle, because institutional accountability almost always takes longer than the immediate news cycle. And anyone who has ever tried to hold an institution accountable knows this and plans accordingly. Marcus Holt did not resign. This was in some ways the most complicated part. He had not participated in the federal cover-up. He had not placed fabricated documents in her file. What he had done was spend 3 years making a talented clinician's professional life and exercise in sustained diminishment, and the law had no specific instrument for that. And the network's HR process would take its time with it, and the outcome would be imperfect and partial and real, which was the way outcomes usually were. He did, in the weeks that followed, begin running rounds differently. She noticed it not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. He stopped the public corrections, stopped the calibrated humiliation in the hallway, started directing clinical questions to nurses in a register that acknowledged they might know the answers. It was not transformation. It was adjustment. She did not confuse the two. She filed the record restoration request on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of October, sitting at the kitchen table of her apartment with the window open to the autumn version of the Carolina coast, which was the best version, she had decided, the one where the heat broke and the water went gray-green and the pelicans came back to the harbor in numbers. She signed it and scanned it and sent it to Garrett's secure contact. He sent back a single word, good. Reardon called that evening. They talked for 2 hours, longer than they had talked in 4 years combined, longer than either of them had probably planned to, because conversation between people who have been through the same specific thing has a momentum that isn't fully controlled from the outside. They talked about the 3 men. They said their names out loud, Pierce, Odom, Hargrove. They said what those men had been like and what had happened to them and why, and what it had cost both of them to carry the true account of it through years when no official document held it. It was not a neat conversation. It had stops and starts and moments where neither of them spoke, and it did not resolve into anything tidy, Because grief doesn't resolve into anything tidy, and neither does anger. And the only thing either of them could actually do with 4 years of both was what they were doing, saying the names, telling the true story to each other, making sure it existed somewhere outside their own heads. At the end of it, Reardon said, "What are you going to do with the department offer?" "I'm going to take it," Nora said. "The clinical education role." "Teaching?" "Emergency trauma protocol, new staff, nursing residents." She looked at the window. "There are a lot of people in hospital departments who don't know what they're capable of because nobody ever showed them." "You're going to show them." "I'm going to try." She paused. "It's not a perfect job." "No." "It's not a resolution." "No," Reardon said. "It's just what comes next." What came next was the morning in November when Nora arrived at Harbor Reach in the early light and walked through the main entrance and signed in at the desk and took the elevator to the third floor, where the new role lived in an office that still smelled like the previous occupants' coffee habits, with a window that looked out over the south side of the harbor. She had a desk. She had a laptop. She had a stack of training curricula that she'd spent 2 weeks reviewing and marking up, because the existing materials were adequate, and adequacy was not what she was here to provide. She had, on the corner of the desk, a framed photograph that Kira had printed for her from a hospital security camera. Still, the image from the night of the storm, from Bay 1, captured at approximately 1 in the morning, the angle looking down from the corner-mounted camera. In it, you could see the trauma bay from above. You could see the monitor on the wall. You could see the operators and the resident and the techs arranged around the table. And at the center, with her back to the camera, you could see a woman in scrubs working with the specific kind of focus that looks, from the outside, like calm. She didn't frame it because it was flattering. She framed it because it was true. That morning, she had 6 residents in a conference room off the training wing, and she had a whiteboard and a case study she'd built from a hypothetical that was not, structurally, entirely hypothetical. And she had 37 years of combined civilian and operational experience in rooms where the decisions were not theoretical. She looked at the 6 people in front of her. They were young and tired and smart and uncertain in the specific way that capable people are uncertain before they learn what they're made of. "We're going to start with the basics," she said. "Not because you don't know them, but because the basics are the thing you reach for when everything else breaks, and they need to be automatic before they need to be useful." She uncapped the marker. "The first thing I want you to understand is that the most dangerous moment in any emergency is not when things go wrong. It's when the person in the room who knows what to do waits for permission." Nobody said anything. They were listening. "You're going to make mistakes in this job. Some of them will matter. You're going to be in rooms with people who outrank you who are wrong, and you're going to have to decide what to do about that in real time with a patient in front of you." She wrote a number on the board. The number of seconds it takes for brain function to deteriorate without oxygen. The system doesn't always reward the right call. The institution doesn't always protect the person who made it. You might spend years doing the right thing without anyone acknowledging it. She turned around and looked at them. Do it anyway. Not because you'll be seen, not because it will be recognized, but because the person on the table in front of you is the only metric that matters in that moment. And you are the only person in that moment who can close the gap between what's happening and what needs to happen. She set the marker down. That's the job. The rest of it, the politics, the hierarchy, the people who make you feel small so they don't have to feel ordinary, that's noise. Learn to tell the difference. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the harbor was doing what the harbor did, moving, gray-green and indifferent, under a sky that had weather in it, but nothing dangerous. The ordinary motion of water that has survived everything thrown at it and will continue to do so long after the storms that made it temporary news have been forgotten. She had spent 4 years being invisible because it was safer, and 3 years before that being erased because someone decided her account of the truth was inconvenient, and she understood now, not as a recovered lesson, but as something she had worked her way to through the actual cost of its absence, that silence was not survival. It looked like survival. It had the shape of survival. But the thing that actually kept you going through the years when no one saw you was not the silence. It was the work. It was always the work. "Open your case files," she said. "We have a lot to cover."